If you're not from South America, this might come as a shock. Almost every country down here speaks Spanish. Except one. The biggest one. The loudest one, where soccer games sound like rock concerts and people say everything's fine while clearly on fire. Yeah, Brazil. And we don't speak Spanish, we speak Portuguese. Which makes a lot of people go, wait, what? Why Portuguese? Did they just pick a different language for fun? Not exactly. See, there's a whole story behind that, with empires, wars, explorers who couldn't read maps, and some very questionable treaties signed by people who'd never set foot in the Americas. It's a story that starts in Europe with Latin, not the sexy kind, the ancient Roman kind, and somehow ends with 200 million people saying beleza instead of que tal. So grab your coffee or your caipirinha, I don't judge, because today we're talking about why Brazil doesn't speak Spanish and how the Portuguese language went global, tripped over a few continents, and landed here, dancing samba. So, let's rewind a couple of thousand years, back to the Roman Empire. Back then, Latin was the language. If you were a Roman soldier, a merchant, or a very dramatic senator, you spoke Latin. But when the empire collapsed, Latin didn't just vanish. It stuck around, but everyone started speaking it their own way. Kind of like how English sounds totally different in London, New York, and Australia. Only this time, the differences grew so much that Latin basically exploded into new languages. That's how we got French, Italian, Spanish, and, on the far Atlantic coast, Portuguese. Well, not Portuguese yet. First came something called Galego-Portuguese, a soft, melodic dialect spoken in what's now northern Portugal and Galicia in Spain. You could think of it as Latin with a beach vibe. It turned harsh Roman words into gentle ones, dropped some consonants, added extra vowels, and generally made everything sound like a song. While Spain's version of Latin was getting sharper and louder, Portugal's version was vibing. Even the poetry of the time had rhythm, melody, and emotion, and by the Middle Ages, it had already started to sound like real Portuguese. Then, the Portuguese started sailing, and, as we all know, once they started sailing, they didn't really stop. Now that our Latin beach dialect had found its groove, it was time for drama. Because on the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain were basically siblings who couldn't share a room without fighting. They started out side by side, both Catholic, both ambitious, both dreaming of sailing into the sunset and calling whatever they found theirs. But Portugal wanted independence. They were like, hey Castile, we love you, but it's not me, it's you. Also, please stop invading our borders. After a few centuries of breakups, makeups, and the medieval equivalent of subtweets, they officially went their separate ways. Portugal turned west toward the ocean and said, fine, you keep Europe, we'll take literally everything else. And they meant it. By the 15th century, the Portuguese were everywhere. Africa, India, even reaching Japan, which is wild because Japan is really far away. But then came the ultimate sibling moment, dividing the entire planet like it was a pizza. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas drew an invisible line from top to bottom of the world. Everything to the west, Spain's. Everything to the east, Portugal's. Of course, none of the people who'll actually live there were invited to the meeting. And here's the funny part. That line, which was meant to keep them from fighting, accidentally cut right through South America. On one side, Spanish, on the other, Portuguese. And on the perfect side of that line, the future Brazil. So yeah, Brazil doesn't speak Spanish because 500 years ago, 2 European kingdoms decided to play dibs with the globe, and Portugal just happened to win that one. When the Portuguese arrived in what's now Brazil, they brought their language with them, but it didn't stay the same for long. Because honestly, how could it? They were suddenly surrounded by hundreds of indigenous peoples, each with their own languages, Tupinambe, Guarani, Chicula, Pataxó, and the newcomers didn't exactly understand any of them, so they borrowed words, sounds, and even ways of saying the trolled. That's how Brazilian Portuguese got abacaxi, pineapple, pipoca, popcorn, tattoo, armadillo, and ipiranga. Later came millions of Africans enslaved and forced to work in Brazil. People who spoke Yoruba, Kimbundu, Kikongo, and many others. They too left traces, rhythm, vocabulary, intonation. Even today, you can hear it in everyday speech, in words like moleque, cafune, samba, in the melody of how Brazilians talk, how they stretch vowels, how they sing when they speak. Then came waves of immigrants, Italians, Germans, Japanese, Lebanese, each adding new accents, new habits, new dishes, and new slang. By the 19th century, Brazilian Portuguese had drifted so far from its European parent that it felt like a different creature altogether. Softer, slower, more musical. Portuguese had learned to dance, to stretch out its vowels like it was enjoying the sun, to turn grammar rules into suggestions. That's why when you compare Portuguese from Lisbon and Portuguese from Rio, it's like comparing espresso to caipirinha. Same base ingredient, completely different experience. So, while Portuguese was doing its tropical transformation, Spanish was spreading like wildfire across the rest of Latin America. From Mexico to Argentina, Spanish, Spanish, Spanish. And that's how Brazil ended up being the only Portuguese-speaking country in a sea of Spanish. Now, here's the funny part. Portuguese and Spanish are really close. They're like cousins who grew up in the same town, went to different schools, and now pretend they don't understand each other. About 90% of the words look almost the same, but that 10%, that's where chaos lives. Embarazada. In Spanish, it means pregnant. In Portuguese, embarazada means tangled up. Completely different problems. An apology? In Portuguese, apologia means defense or advocacy. So if you say, I wrote an apology for crime, in Portuguese, you're not sorry, you're in trouble. Still, despite all that confusion, we do understand each other, especially when we want to. Ask any Brazilian traveling through Latin America. We can communicate in what we like to call portuñol. Half Portuguese, half Spanish, and 100% improvisation. It's basically linguistic jazz. Somewhere along the borders, and especially online, something magical started happening. Portuguese and Spanish stopped fighting and started mixing. The result? Portuñol, the unofficial language of South American friendship, football interviews, and awkward vacations. It's not quite Portuguese, not quite Spanish. It's both and neither, and somehow it works. You'll hear it in border towns like Rivera and Santana do Livramento, where people switch between the two languages in mid-sentence without even noticing. You'll see it in memes, no entiendo pero me gusta, or in TikToks, where Brazilians and Argentinians argue using subtitles and vibes. And it's not just the language, the whole region shares culture. Brazilians grew up watching Javed and Maria de Bairro. Meanwhile, half of Latin America danced to I Sei Eu Te Vego and thought, I have no idea what he's saying, but I feel it. Telenovelas, football, music, memes. We've been exchanging them for decades. Language differences barely slow it down. So maybe Portuñol isn't just a mix of words. It's a mix of identities. The sign that deep down, Brazilians and their neighbors understand each other better than they think. Alright, you survived all the history. Time for your reward. A very short Portuguese lesson. No grammar, no conjugation, just vibes. First up, oi. It means hi. That's it. Simple, friendly, efficient. Then there's tudo bem. Literally everything good. It's how we say hello, goodbye, and all hanging in there. Even when life is falling apart, we say tudo bem. Because honestly, what else are we going to say? Now, poesia, impossible to translate. It can mean yeah, yep, wow, I told you so, or what can you do? It's like a verbal sigh with philosophical depth. But if there's one word you should remember, it's saudade. It means missing something, but also feeling the missing. It's the space between joy and sadness, between what you had and what you still carry inside. There's no perfect English equivalent, and Brazilians are kinda proud of that. We don't just miss, we feel the absence. Deeply, musically, we even write songs about it. So yeah, if you learn oi, tudo bem, poesia, and saudade, you can survive in Brazil. And maybe, just maybe, understand a little bit of how Brazilians see the world. So, why doesn't Brazil speak Spanish? Because 500 years ago, 2 European kingdoms drew a line on a map and everything east of that line started speaking Portuguese. But along the way, that language changed. It met forests and beaches, drums and dances, pain and joy. It mixed with hundreds of other voices. Portuguese didn't just arrive in Brazil, it grew roots. Anyway, that's the story of how one empire's language got lost at sea and came back dancing samba. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, beleza? It really helps the channel. And if you want to see more stories like this about Brazil, culture, and the weird ways the world connects, hit subscribe, share it with a friend, and I'll see you next time. Até mais. See you later.